We're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Red Newt live virtual tasting here on the YouTube, our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we have a great evening or a great afternoon of Pinot Gris. The 2007 Pinot Gris and the 2010 Pinot Gris from Curry Creek Vineyards. You saw a great aerial view of Curry Creek on the splash screen before you started. It's a really terrific vineyard, just 2 or 3 miles from here. We talked about this before because we buy Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris from John and Allison Santos, the growers at Curry Creek, when we've been working with them for, 15 years, a long time, since the early 2000s when they planted the vineyard. And it's a small vineyard, only about 4 acres, split roughly half and half between Pinot Gris and Gewürz, and it all comes here. Some years it's a big crop, like a handful of tons each, and sometimes it's a little crop, like maybe a ton each. So it varies from year to year. But in any case, 2 great wines. And so, yeah, let's get started. Anybody have any kind of love stories about Pinot Gris to share?
So I like full disclosure, for the longest time, whenever everybody was like, oh, what's your favorite grape? What's your favorite grape? You know, I always had an answer, but what's your least favorite grape? It was always Pinot Gris. I think because so many of the Pinot Gris that I'd had in the past had been kind of blousy or blasé or just honestly a little boring and not really anything to them. And it wasn't really till I started like tasting really thoughtfully made Pinot Gris that my mind was changed with that. And even Kelby has noticed, especially this year when we go to the tank, that of our Pinot Gris that we've got in the cellar right now, every time I taste it, I'm like, wow, this is really good. So I've become a Pinot Gris, fanatic now, after having been exposed to some. And I think these two really show what Pinot Gris can do, rather than be like this fresh kind of fruity fun thing, but actually like a serious wine with some age to it.
My favorite memories of Pinot Gris were being 17 in Europe, and a lot of wines from Alsace were the first wines to come into Hungary and be available besides Alsatian wines. And my host father was a doctor, he was a cardiologist. And in order to keep your public doctor that was paid by the Communist Party, you bribed them. And the number one thing that we were bribed with was wine, whether it be champagne, wine from out of country, whatever they could get their hands on. Thank God they didn't pay in live chickens. There were enough people and animals in the house. But my very first exposure were to a lot of small batch Alsatian Pinot Gris that were coming across the border. And I became very enamored of them. I thought they were awesome. I like a slightly leaner, meaner style. I think that the way that the Finger Lakes Rieslings or Pinot Gris are being made now is very reflective of a very specific style, depending on the house. And I've always loved our style. So we're tasting kind of 2 of my favorites right now.
Yeah. Which were you going to taste first?
Probably the 07, because the 10 has a little bit more residual sugar.
A little fatter.
Yeah.
So is that what people have in their glass?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Oh, Meg's is right.
07 a hot vintage as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both 2007 and 2010 were warm vintages.
Both of them were warm.
Yeah, 07 was a lot drier, to the verge of, some moderate drought stress, not in the more mature vineyards. Let's see, 2007, this is a pretty young vineyard in 2007, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But they were both very warm and quite ripe. 2010 a lot better.
Yeah, I think what Meg spoke to is a curse of Pinot Gris right now. And in some ways, it's a curse of Pinot Grigio, which is same grape. I think most of the people watching this probably know that, but it's the same grape as Pinot Gris. It's just, it's a language difference. It's Italian versus French, but in the wine world, it's more often used to describe, kind of be a stylistic marker, with Pinot Grigio being very popular, but also tending to be, there was a great wine review once, like a satirical wine review that was reviewing all Pinot Grigios and described them as smelling like summer breezes, which is to say not much of anything. And to make a more serious style, it's not maybe everyone's cup of tea, but it allows you to really express what is a beautiful grape. And I mean, is clonally, I mean, it's basically a clone of Pinot Noir at its heart. And this is a site that lets us do that year in and year out.
It's funny because as I smell this, I'm remembering a very long conversation that we had at FL Excursion this summer regarding the concept and sometimes overuse of the word minerality when it comes to describing Rieslings in particular, but it also pertains to Pinot Gris. And for me, every time I smell this, it smells like walking into the Watkins Glen State Park, the gorge, right after a great big rain. That to me is what wet slate and shale and all of that, to that kind of wet rock smell is what I always associate with this, especially when you go in first thing in the spring.
I love that phenomena of sort of suggestive bias. I hadn't noticed that, but when you talked about walking into the gorge, I've walked that gorge many times, and others, and yeah, it's kind of the shady, gray, wet, not the moss that grows on it, but the rock itself. Yeah.
This might be a controversial statement, but I think this 07 Pinot Gris is actually holding up better than a lot of 07 Rieslings. Which, right, we think of, and by and large, generally true, Riesling ages spectacularly and would usually age on the whole better than Pinot Gris. But I think in a really hot, dry vintage like 07, there's something about the natural sort of weight and texture of Pinot Gris that lets it age in a way that the Rieslings can sometimes get stripped by all the heat.
Yeah. Well, this reminds me, the 2007 vintage was really warm and ripe. And it was one of the first years, well, it was sort of the year at Curry Creek where I decided that we were just going to push the envelope and see where we could go, both with Gewurz and Pinot Gris. Gewurz, we'd been picking the fruit quite ripe for a few years at Curry Creek. 24, 25 bricks, really beautiful fruit. And I said to myself, you know what, we're just going to let it hang. And as long as the fruit keeps maturing and we get more richness and more sugar, and we picked the Gewurz, I don't know what it was, 26, 27 brick. It was really ripe. Mm-hmm. And the Pinot Gris was really ripe as well. And we picked them probably about the same day or very close to one another. As a result, this wine is pretty dry, maybe 4 grams of sugar or so, but the alcohol is up around 14%. So it's really, I think that really has lent, contributed to its longevity. Mm-hmm. The alcohol at this point is just beautifully integrated and just gives nice crisp structure and sort of an ethereal kind of expression.
Yeah, I mean, I remember tasting this over the years. I mean, I remember tasting it probably back in 2009 or 10 as well. We're having it opened at something I was at, and the alcohol being positive but sticking out in a way that isn't true anymore. Right, like it's really beautifully balanced and just sits inside the wine so nicely.
Yeah, and even for that sugar ripeness and what translated into the alcohol, I think we're still looking at a really good balance of like T and pH, and there's something very elegant about this wine. Mm-hmm. There really is. And to me, I've always kind of associated with Pinot Gris with almost like an amaretto. So it's always got like a cherry or almond character to me. And this really drives thickly into that with really like kind of like expounding upon like that richness of like the nut fat that you would get from almonds.
Kind of grows on you.
It's funny. I have several friends who always poo-pooed Pinot Grigio because it was just, there's so much of it out there, and you pick up a box and it says dry and you turn the box around and the sugar is like through the roof on it, or they haven't had any quality Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. And I kept a bottle of this out for one of my more discerning friends who was born in Belgium, but she was raised in Milano, Italy, and she's an archaeologist. And I happened to have a bottle of this on me one day when I stopped by her house. And when we opened it up and we tasted it, she goes, "That's amazing. The Finger Lakes makes that?" Because it's not a grape that's typically found in the Finger Lakes, and to find really nice ones is tricky. And she said to me, she goes, "Well, how long can I cellar it?" I'm like, "You can cellar it for quite a while." I think she drank her last one about 2 years ago, and I was lucky to still have this one here in the cellar. But I've been really surprised to see how well it's done with age. I knew it would age. I didn't realize it would age this well for this long.
Mhm.
I think you mentioned, or you or Kelby mentioned a minute ago, this idea of trying to find the place or the style or the expression that fits, that we feel fits with the Finger Lakes of Pinot Gris, because it is really pretty. You can make a straightforward, light, boring Pinot Gris pretty easily. I mean, it's like kind of like falling off a log.
Yep.
But to really capture some character and expression in the wine it's much more difficult, and it's not just technically difficult. It's the difficult part is conceptualizing what that should be, and then figuring out how what the path is to get there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it bears mentioning that Pinot Gris we think of as a white wine, which I mean certainly these are, but the grape itself is actually, I mean, pink skinned. It's gray, right? Is the term gray, Grigio gray? It's relatively dark, and in a site like Curry Creek, I mean, it almost looks like Pinot Noir hanging on the vine. It's so dark. I mean, it's kind of shocking how intense the hue is. And there are years where we get a little bit of pink certainly a little bit of pink in the juice. But the skins also have a lot of the character that comes from that vineyard and the ripeness that they're able to achieve.
Yeah, I think if for any of you that read the email and wanted to follow our link, there was a cluster that I was holding in my very dirty harvest hand, which was mostly actually like the dark Pinot Gris, but also had a couple of like really bright green grapes in it. And so that is like kind of the mutability that is part of this grape. So we got Pinot Gris. So that is your gray or purple, as we'll call it. You've got your green, which is Pinot Blanc, and then also your Pinot Noir. And so in that particular cluster, you've got your Pinot Gris with like a couple of mutations of Pinot Blanc showing through.
That was a cool
And
thing.
I missed part of this, so I'm just curious. Do we have any of these vintages in stock still?
Not a lot, but they're both of course, on our online store. And the 2007, there's about 7 cases, and I think the 2010, there's maybe 10 cases, 8 or 10 cases.
Great.
Yeah, it's been fun this year, and really just in the past few months, because we've really dug into the library and brought everything upstairs and put it all online. So, and it's forcing us to methodically taste through them on these tastings too, and it's a delight. Thanks everybody for
what a job.
It is a horrible job, and I've got the perfect cheese for this too.
So how about this 2010? Boy, that nose sure is different, huh?
Yeah, much different.
Color is also different to me. I don't know if that's just my bottle. My cork was a little wonky, but it's a bigger wine, and the color shows that as well. There's a little more richness to the hue.
Yep. Yeah, my 2010 is significantly darker in hue than my 7.
Yeah, it was a little more RS. This is around 13 grams, but it was very ripe as well. I mean, pushing that envelope, the alcohol is above 14 on this one as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it has a lot more plumpness on the palate, sort of ripe fruit, raisiny kind of plumpness, and just weight. Not quite as delicate and austere as the 2007, but really pretty.
Was it equally as dry in 2010?
Well, 2010, it was a real warm vintage, but we had a lot of rain throughout the summer. So there was lots of moisture. I mean, there was some disease pressure, but more importantly, there was lots of soil in the moisture in the soil consistently the whole summer. So as a result, there was a lot of vegetative growth. We had big canopies, lots of leaves, and pretty substantial crops. But lots of guys out there doing photosynthesis, ripening these grapes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a little bit more richness and broadness that's that I'm getting from this vintage than I did from the 07. Like just a little bit more breadth to it.
I
And
might
when
be
you talk about, when a lot of times when we talk about a lot of the secondary characteristics of Riesling, there's so much more of those beautiful baked characteristics in this one than I have ever tasted in it before. I haven't tasted this one in a while, so
Mhm. I
just
dare say
aromatic is so much a 180 from what we have in the 07.
Oh, great. What else? Is there anything more of these wines, or should we start talking about dinner?
Well, what I was going to ask Dave was there an actual, like, did we pick these two vintages at different Brix levels? Did we intentionally do them in two different residual sugar levels?
Well, I can tell you the 2010 was picked at even a higher sugar than the 2007.
Oh,
And
okay.
there was a lot slower fermentation, so it was stretched into early in the, sort of January, February. I think it was pretty slow fermentation, ticking along really slow. Now, back in those days, we didn't have these fermentations like every other time going to February or March like we do now. It was kind of really on the edge back in 2000, a decade ago. Yeah, so there was more sugar to start with. And again, the alcohol is even a little bit higher, by a few tenths than 2007, and still an extra 10 grams of sugar. So had we fermented it down to 4 grams of sugar like we did the 2007, we would be up around 15% alcohol. So there was a lot of discussion and tasting around that issue towards the end of fermentation of where it was going to fall and how it's going to fall in a balanced, nicely expressive way.
And so, I mean, really, just to be honest, like, what brought you to bring Pinot Gris as part of the portfolio to Red New Cellars? Because Riesling, yeah, we get it, Riesling. Gewurz, yeah, it's quirky, it's different, and you can see why people that are always beating their own drum would want to make Gewurz, because it's so unique and it's so different. But outside of Pinot Gris being another one of the aromatic whites and technically a cool kind of grape, I mean, why put it into the portfolio?
2 words: John Santos.
Santos.
John
I was
Santos
wondering if you were going to say that.
is a grower, and he's a really incredible, very knowledgeable, passionate, insightful grower. A little bit quirky too. He's a really interesting guy. And so he planted this. I first met John back in the probably late 80s, early 90s, and he was involved. He's kind of involved in the grape industry. Had studied, I believe he studied horticulture or some sort of plant science. But anyway, he was a real fanatic about Alsatian wines, and he loved these big, rich Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminers from Alsace. And he felt that the Finger Lakes was a perfect place to grow grapes to make great Pinot Gris and Gewürz. So he planted this vineyard, split between the two of them. And when he approached us, or we approached him, I can't remember, about buying grapes, it was such a small vineyard. I mean, he had a full-time job as a vineyard manager for a pretty large vineyard. This was his home plot where he put all of his passion and inspiration into it. And it was split between Pinot Gris and Gewürz. And we just said, okay, we'll just take it all. And that's the way it kind of worked. And so that's how it ended up in our portfolio. And it's really, I'm really happy it did. It's been a lot of fun.
John's approach to grape growing is so passionate that I swear it's infectious. I made the mistake once in my much younger years of asking him, while we were all out shooting darts for the league, what his favorite trellising system was. And 4.5 hours later, I had the final answer. I think I had to get tapped on the shoulder every single time to continue, playing league darts, because I was actually extremely interested in everything that he had to say, because he was so knowledgeable. He was so passionate about it. You couldn't help but be infected by his passion at the same time. So, I mean, my heart sings that we actually are able to have these grapes, because they really are a wonderful expression of Pinot Gris in the Finger Lakes. I don't think there is another house in the Finger Lakes that makes a Pinot Gris similar to ours. I think everyone has a very slightly different, but I think ours really tend to kind of stand separate from the others.
Yeah, and I think that the approach to Pinot Gris, particularly in these sort of early years of our relationship with John at Curry Creek, really kind of followed, to a large degree, our philosophy, the philosophy of Gewürztraminer, of really advanced physiological and flavor maturity, and resulting in the sugar was kind of like, well, you have to deal with the sugar wherever it is. There's plenty of it, but it was more about flavors and maturity, and also, I guess I'm kind of I don't want to say I'm stubborn or anything, but I didn't want to make a thin, boring, insipid Pinot Grigio thing. So that I tried not to even go down that path. So, yeah, a lot of fun.
Well, we finally have a couple of questions. And of course, they come from Rob Maines, one of our favorite club members who's out in Saratoga Springs. Normally, he would be doing a duathlon or a marathon this weekend, but he's kind of quarantined, so we can't. So instead, I know he's spending a lot of money on Corvin canisters and drinking lots of different things. He says, right now, we've got 3 vintages of Pinot Gris. We have the 11, the 13, and the 14. And he says, should we typically expect lower alcohol in body in cooler summers compared to warmer summers?
Well, I can speak to the 11, which I think is a little bit lower in sugar, if I remember. 11 was, we harvested quite a bit earlier in 11, I'm sure, just because of, it was a really cool year and lots of botrytis, disease pressure. And also, I think we've kind of refined our harvest strategies as we've moved along. And I'll let Kelby and Megs talk about the 13 and 14 in terms of how they fit in.
Yeah, I mean, those 2 wines, a bit of an evolution towards, it seemed like as the vines have got older, I should say, at Curry Creek, and bigger in some ways, that the ripening timeline's a little different. I mean, we think of younger vines putting on sugar more readily, more often than not, than their older counterparts. And it means that the balance point that we can now aim for is more, I would say, like 13% with a finished dry wine. Outside of real outlier vintages, which we're always happy to see as well, but except if they're bad outliers. But it does mean that, we can hang the fruit almost as long as these and get these really beautiful expressions, still very weighty expressions of Pinot Gris, but maybe a little bit less oily than before. I mean, that doesn't always hold true. You get a vintage like 15, which was pretty, it was average. I don't know that it was cool. It was an average vintage. But the 15 version of anything from Curry Creek was pretty weighty, just from how things developed in the vineyard. And we had a lot of fun with that as well.
Okay. And Mary Bigelow is asking, where is John Santos's vineyard? So Curry Creek is actually located on Beckhorn Road, which is roughly 2 miles north of Red Newt Cellars. And if you've ever hung out in the Lucky Here beer garden there in the back part of the house, and you just literally look across the street, just behind the bushes, you'll see all of Curry Creek. And it's a really beautiful vineyard. It's had a lot of rain the last couple of days, but all the new bridges held, which was beautiful. And we should start seeing some really beautiful green and some good bud formation here in the next couple of days.
Yeah, it's downhill from here, probably, I don't know, 100 feet downhill, but it's there's a long slope down into Valois, and then the slope back up back towards Wagner on up to the north. But it's kind of nestled there in that little bit of a dip as it approaches the dip. And also to note, when we talked about Lahoma vineyards, we talked about Dunkirk soils being sort of the primary soil on the knoll. And Dunkirk is also the primary soil in this Curry Creek Vineyard site.
Oh, interesting.
If you're a soil girl, like me. All right.
All right. So
are we hungry?
Dinner time's coming here. Well, let me see. To my left, I think. It's always different on my screen. What are you having for dinner, Megs?
So we're gonna do grilled pizza tonight, and I've got two different pizzas that I want to do. One with chev and fig chutney and a little bit of arugula, a little balsamic glaze over that, and the other one more of a traditional pizza with not necessarily your traditional pepperoni, but a nice salami and some mozzarella cheese and whatnot. And yeah, it's been nice. I've been out in the garden today, so I'm going to keep being outside as long as I can right now.
I hear you.
How about you, Heather?
So, like Megs, I spent an exorbitant amount of time outside today, getting more greens growing and more greens growing. So I'm going to be doing panko Parmesan crusted asparagus tonight. And then I also have some beautiful carrots that I julienned, and we've got some broccoli, and I've got some cabbage, and I'm going to do another light stir fry, and I have some shrimp to go on top of that.
Mm.
I'll top it all off with some lively run FLX Gold.
Ooh, that sounds great. How about you, Rebecca?
I've been on a Vietnamese kick lately, and so I'm gonna just keep on that. I think I'm gonna make some banh mi tonight. I have a bunch of pickled carrots left over still, so yeah, I think that would be really nice with this spicy little pork sandwich.
Mm. How about you, Kelby?
I'm apparently in a similar wavelength as Meg's, although we're doing calzones tonight. I think this will be really nice. I picked up some fresh ricotta right before we recorded here, and I've got some broccoli rabe and some meatballs to go in. So
Delicious.
Yeah. Well, I'm on the Meg's wavelength too, staying outside as long as I can. So the first priority is lighting the grill and burning something on the grill. And we did go to the farmer's market this morning, picked up a couple bunches of ramps, which I just love, just sort of blackened, like charred on a charcoal fire. So it's gonna be that. I have some beets, actually some beets that I cooked yesterday. I think I might slice those and put them on the sort of smoke them a little bit on the grill, and maybe just some grilled vegetables and ramps on some rice or something really simple and very much summery. And with both these wines, I think that that sort of little bit of char of smoke and char is going to really be a beautiful complement to these wines. So that's where I'm at.
Sounds yummy.
All right. Well, let me just pour a little taste more so I can give a closing toast. So here's to Pinot Gris and summer. It sure feels like summer here. Thank you, everybody here on the screen. Thank you all for watching. And if you're watching, like not tonight, but another, how do you do that? If you're not watching May 2nd, but another day, cheers to you too.
Cheers.
Cheers.